everyone, I hope you're all doing really well. Today I thought we could do some cooking together again, and I thought it was time for me to do a budget meals video. I haven't done it before, but I do cook a lot of budget meals in my day-to-day, like I'm sure a lot of you do too. And I think at the moment many of us feel a need to tighten our food budget, so I thought it was the perfect time for a video like this. And I have 3 dishes to share with you today. A potato, kidney bean and spinach curry, some savory sauerkraut fritters, and finally a white bean, leek and kale soup. And the idea here is that each serving in all of these meals should come to less than €2 or pounds or dollars. But of course it depends on where you are in the world, what foods are more budget friendly in your country. I've obviously based this on what I can get my hands on here in Sweden, and I think this should cover Europe and sort of the North Americas, but I can't say for everywhere. But I'll be using mainly staple items that are cheap in most places without sacrificing on flavor and fun in the kitchen. And the first recipe I'm going to make is the potato curry. And of course I've borrowed flavors from India here. It's a cuisine that I really love, and it also lends itself well to vegan budget cooking because a lot of the vegan dishes that come from this region uses good staples, basics that are cheap, like beans and pulses, and in this case potato. So let's dive right in. To start, I peel and slice up 2 smaller or 1 large red onion. I like to make them into half-moon shapes. And then I also peel and finely slice 4 large garlic cloves. And these 2 will be part of making a good base for the curry. Next I heat up about 1 tablespoon of vegetable oil in a large pot, and then I grab 2 teaspoons of cumin seeds that I will temper in the oil, which means that I'll let them sizzle in there for about a minute or 2 or until they're nice and golden. Once that's happened, I add in the onion and let that saute for a couple of minutes until it softens. I sprinkle in my sliced garlic and allow that to saute for another minute or 2 until fragrant and a little bit softer than when I threw it in. Then I go in with 1½ can of finely chopped tomatoes, and this will form the base for the gravy in the curry. To spice things up, I go in with 1½ tablespoons of hot curry powder, but you could use mild if you prefer. I also add in 1½ teaspoon of garam masala, and I stir that through the tomatoes before I add in about 1½ cups of water. For a savory depth to the gravy, I crumble in 1 vegetable stock cube, and you could add in 2 here, it just depends on your taste, but start with 1 and see how you go. I also season with salt before I let the gravy simmer while I cube up some pre-cooked potatoes. To serve about 6 people, I use 550 grams of potatoes that have been pre-cooked, so this is a dish that's great to do when you have leftover potatoes from dinner the night before. I add them to the gravy and then stir them through before I add 2 cans of kidney beans that I've drained and rinsed. If you wanted to make this dish even more budget friendly, you could cook the beans from scratch, and then you would add about 2 cups of cooked beans. At this point we will allow the curry to simmer for 10 to 15 minutes for the flavors to come together, and then I add in 100 grams of baby spinach and stir that through once I've turned the heat off. This will allow the greens to wilt gently, and then it's ready to serve. You could serve yourself or your family up by the stove, sort of grab and go style, or you could do it family style and dish it up in a nice plate. And I like to serve this with some yummy rice on the side. I really think this makes a satisfying and warming dinner for autumn. So here I've served the curry with rice, but you could also serve it with flatbreads, and if you wanted to spice things up a little bit and have a little bit more room in the budget, you could add some chutney or some fresh coriander sprinkled on top. This dish is really great for cooking in bulk. You can keep it in the fridge for a few days. It also freezes really well, so you could keep it in the freezer for when you need a quick meal and you don't have the energy to do a lot of cooking. And now I want to move on to making the sauerkraut fritters. But before we do that, I want to thank Squarespace for sponsoring this video and tell you a little bit more about them. Squarespace is an all-in-one website builder with lots of great tools to make it easy to build a beautiful and well-functioning site without any previous knowledge about coding or website building. Personally, I've used Squarespace to create my online food photography portfolio, and I really like that it is so easy and intuitive to use. There are plenty of themes, font combinations, and color combos on Squarespace to get you started, and there are themes for many different purposes, so it's great for everyone from business owners and e-commerce all the way to creatives and bloggers. So if you're thinking about creating a website for any purpose, check out squarespace.com for a free trial, and when you're ready to launch your site, go to squarespace.com/goodeatings for 10% off your first website or domain. So now let's make the sauerkraut fritters, and these are actually loosely inspired by Korean kimchi pancakes, but here in Sweden kimchi is pretty pricey, so I thought, what can we do instead that is yummy and fermented and might be good in a pancake or a fritter too, and that is sauerkraut. I bought the sort of cheap sauerkraut from the supermarket that maybe isn't the most tasty to eat on its own, but it works really great in these fritters. And I've also changed the seasonings a little bit from a traditional Korean kimchi pancake, and I'm also using chickpea flour instead of wheat flour here to give it a little bit more nutritional density, I guess. But without further ado, let's make the fritters. To control the level of liquid in our batter, I start off this recipe by squeezing out the juice out of 2 cups worth of sauerkraut. You don't have to be vigilant here, but squeeze out most of the juice so that you can add just the right amount later. Next, I slice up 4 spring onions into thin match-like strips. I haven't quite figured out the best way to do this, but I usually slice them lengthways a few times and then just cut them on the other end 3 or 4 times depending on the length of the spring onion. To add even more interest and oniony flavor, I slice up 1 red onion into half moons and add that to the bowl as well with the other vegetables. Now it's time to create the batter, and for this I used 1½ cup of chickpea or gram flour. I also add in ½ cup of potato flour, or here in Sweden we call it starch. Next, to give it some flavor, I add in 4 teaspoons of persilade. It's a spice mix that we use here in Sweden that has dried parsley, garlic granules, and salt. But I also season with some extra salt and pepper, and usually I add in a 1/4 teaspoon of turmeric here, but I did forget. And then I just mix it all up gently before I pour in my liquids. And firstly, to capitalize on that sauerkraut tanginess, I add in ½ cup of the sauerkraut juice that we squeezed before, and then I go in with 1 1/3 cup of cold water. I mix it up really well, and yes, I like to use my hands, and then it's ready to fry. I heat up about 1 to 2 tablespoons of vegetable oil in a big skillet, and then I start to dollop the pancakes in there. This batter will make about 12 pancakes and serve 4 people or 3 people depending on how hungry you are. And you'll want to fry the first side for about 3 to 4 minutes over medium heat, and then flip it and fry for another 2 to 3 minutes. But just keep an eye on them. You don't want to burn them, but you do want them to have a little bit of color. In the summer, you could serve these with some creme fraiche mixed with fresh herbs and salt, but here I'm serving it with some mayonnaise sprinkled with some more persilade. So I like to serve these fritters with a little bit of mayonnaise for dipping, but of course you could serve it with any dipping sauce that you think they would go well with. If you like spicy, I think they would taste really good with some sriracha mayonnaise as well. But now we're moving on to the last recipe for this video, and it's a soup. I love soup. I hope you do too, because here comes another one. And this one is pretty fresh. I'm flavoring it with some lemon and thyme. And it's a clear-ish soup. You will all become clear soon. And then it's also quite satisfying with the white beans and the little bit of chunky veg that goes in there. So let's get to chopping those to start. I Actually, the first thing I like to prep for this recipe is the kale, and I used 150 grams of dino kale or Cavola Nero that I rip off the stem and then break into smaller pieces. I set the leafy greens aside and I chop up the stem because in this recipe we're not wasting anything, and that's a great budget tip. Next, I dice one brown or yellow onion, but you could really use any type of onion here. And I also dice up 3 or 4 celery ribs. I used 3 quite large ones here. The third component to go into this holy trinity of soup bases is of course carrot, so I chopped 2 large ones of those into small cubes as well. I heat up 1 tablespoon of vegetable oil in a large soup pot, and then I saute my veggies in that. Actually, I sweat them with a lid and some salt, because this allows all the juices to come out nicely and the veggies will start to soften. I leave them like this for about 5 minutes while I chop up my leek. I use 1 leek for this recipe that serves about 4 people, and I like to cut it into rather chunky slices on a diagonal. I just think it looks nice. I also like to slice up about 3 garlic cloves finely to add in with the leek for even more flavor. I saute the leek and garlic in with the other veggies for another 3 to 4 minutes before I add in my water, and I use about 5 or 6 cups here, but start with 5 and see how you go. I also go in with 1 to 2 vegetable stock cubes. This is up to you and your flavor profile, but I like to for a little bit of oomph, and I crumble them in and add in 1 tablespoon of dried thyme as well, which will give this a nice herbaceous flavor. I also season with salt and black pepper before I stir it all up before I add in my cannellini beans. I use 2 cans of beans that I drain and rinse, but again you could cook them from scratch and add about 2 cups to this. Then I let it simmer for about 10 to 15 minutes, halfway covered with a lid, and then it's ready to blitz. And I like to blitz just a part of the soup to give it a little bit of a creamy texture, but still allow for a lot of chunks to be present. Sometimes I do this by removing some of the soup and blending it in my standing blender, but here I used a stick blender before I added in all those nice leafy greens from the kale and letting them simmer for about 2 to 3 minutes to soften up. To add a lot of freshness and interest to the soup, I like to grate in the zest of half a lemon and then also squeeze in the juice. I do this once I've taken the soup off the heat because I don't really want that flavor to cook, but rather cut through that savoriness of the soup. This soup is best served straight away, but of course you could store it in your fridge as well for the next day. And if you wanted to add a little bit of luxury to this, you could sprinkle in some nutritional yeast at the end for more savory flavor. So those were my 3 budget-friendly meals to share with you today. I hope you enjoy seeing me make them, and I hope you will make them at home in your kitchen as well. And I look forward to seeing you all in the next video. Thank you very much for watching. Take care. Bye!